the 9th day of the 3rd month of Akhit, 714 years before Christ. The air in Thebes was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of harvest and the distant, metallic tang of the Nile. Within the mountain of stone that was the temple of Karnak, the air was cooler still and heavy with the smell of ancient incense, beeswax, and piety. Princess Shepenwepet, daughter of Pharaoh Asorkin-II, her blood a mix of Libyan and Egyptian royalty, took measured steps on limestone worn smooth by 1,000 years of procession. She was 14. The fine white linen of her dress, a weave so intricate it had occupied 10 of her mother's best weavers for half a year, whispered against her skin. Gold bound her wrists and throat, cool and heavy. Oils of myrrh and frankincense, imported at great cost from Punt, glistened in her dark, braided hair. By every visible metric, the quality of her raiment, the solemnity of her escort, the sanctified path she walked, she was being prepared for the highest honor a royal daughter could receive. To become the god's wife of Amun, the earthly consort of the king of the gods. She was utterly terrified. The corridors led deeper, past the great hypostyle hall where sunlight speared through high windows onto forest-like pillars, past the public altars where farmers left simple clay offerings of grain. These were the spaces her father knew, the spaces carved into official reliefs, the spaces that proclaimed Egyptian religion as a symphony of divine order. But she passed beyond them now, through a narrow archway flanked by 2 silent Nubian guards into the restricted ways. The light changed. Torchlight replaced the sun, casting leaping, monstrous shadows on walls suddenly bare of public decoration. The air grew closer. The sound of their footsteps echoed differently, a hollow, intimate sound that spoke of secrets and weight. 3 priestesses accompanied her. They were not guards in the military sense. They did not touch her. They simply flowed beside her with the imperturbable certainty of water finding its course. They were women of the inner temple, their heads shaved, their bodies draped in plain, unbleached linen. Their faces were masks of serene purpose. They had performed this task before. They had led other princesses, daughters of Pe, of Shabaka, of her own grandfather, down these same whispering stones. They knew with clinical precision what awaited in the chamber ahead. The eldest, a woman named Maristure with eyes the color of dried papyrus, spoke. Her voice was low, meant for the corridor alone. "You comprehend the honor, daughter of the dual king. You will become the god's hand, the divine adoratress. Your voice will become the god's whisper, your body his vessel. You will mediate between the earth and the sky. The stability of the 2 lands, the flood of the Nile, the victory of your father's armies, all hinge upon your purity and your service." Shepenwepet understood the words. For 6 months, she had been tutored in theology, ritual, and temple economics. She could recite the 5 sacred names of Amun, knew the liturgical calendar by heart, could calculate the grain yields of the god's wife's estates in the delta. But understanding was an intellectual skeleton. Acceptance was the flesh and blood that refused to clothe it. She knew what tomorrow's public ceremony would entail. The procession before the multitudes in the festival court, the symbolic marriage to the god's statue, the bestowal of titles, the cheers of Thebes. What she did not know, what no scroll had detailed, what no tutor had dared whisper, was what would happen tonight, in these hidden chambers, during rites so sacred that her father, the living Horus, the most mighty bull, had never witnessed them and would never be told their details. The gap between the public spectacle and this private reality was a chasm, and it was across this chasm that the true, brutal transformation would occur, a process about which no one had spoken honestly. At this very moment, her father sat in his palace at El Hiba, perhaps 1,000 paces away as the ibis flies, through walls of stone that might as well have been the mountains of the Jewet, the underworld. He believed his daughter was undergoing final purifications and prayers. He had been told by High Priest Montumhat himself that these ultimate rites were too sacred for even a pharaoh's eyes, that the god required absolute privacy with his chosen bride in these last hours before their cosmic union. Asorkin-II believed this because the alternative, disbelief, would necessitate an action he could not take. The treaty with the Amun priesthood was signed, the political cement of his fragile reign. His daughter's dedication secured the loyalty of Thebes, the religious heart of Egypt, in an age when Assyrian wolves prowled the eastern borders and Libyan chieftains eyed his throne. To acknowledge the true cost of this sacrifice would be to gaze into an abyss that would swallow his sanity. Better to trust the priests. Better to believe the religious authorities who promised honor and divine favor for his child. Meanwhile, that child walked toward a truth her father's mind could not encompass and his heart would not survive. The corridor ended at a door. It was not the towering, gilded bronze doors of the main sanctuary. This was a slab of plain limestone, perfectly fitted, indistinguishable from the wall save for a hairline seam. One priestess produced an iron key from a fold in her garment, a cold, foreign metal in this Bronze Age world. The sound of the lock turning was a sharp, final crack in the silence. The door swung inward without a sound, moving on perfectly balanced stone pivots. The chamber beyond was small, perhaps 15 feet across and circular, a shape rare in Egyptian architecture, suggesting a separate, older purpose. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs, but not the proud, public cartouches and offering formulas. These were smaller, denser, technical. AncientEgyptSecrets, literate in the sacred script, could read them. Instructions, lists, procedural accounts. They documented in dispassionate administrative language what had occurred in this space for centuries. It was a logbook of sanctified suffering. At the chamber's center sat a deep basin carved from a single block of black basalt, filled with a liquid that gleamed dully in the lamplight. It was not water. The smell hit her first, acrid and medicinal, cutting through the incense smoke that coiled in gray tendrils from brass braziers. Natron, the salt of purification, used to desiccate the dead. 4 figures waited in the shadows. They stepped forward as she entered, and the torchlight revealed them. Priests of the highest rank, wearing leopard skins over their shoulders, their bodies painted with ochre and charcoal in patterns that transformed human faces into geometric manifestations of divine authority. They did not speak. They simply watched, their eyes reflecting the flames. As AncientEgyptSecrets crossed the threshold, Marister gestured to the basin. The purification must be total. The mortal self must dissolve. Remove your garments and enter the sacred water. This was the fulcrum, the moment where the official narrative of sacred preparation and the hidden reality of systematic dismantling violently diverged. Everything that followed would be wrapped in the language of ritual, service, and transcendence. But the physical reality involved procedures that would have frozen Osorkon's blood in his veins had they been described in plain language. The genius of the system was that they never would be. To understand how AncientEgyptSecrets came to be in that chamber, one must first understand the colossus that was the Amun priesthood. Egypt's religion was never monolithic. It was a constellation of cults, each with its own deity, temple, and priests. Pharaoh was the theoretical pinnacle, the chief priest of every god. But practicality bred power. Amun began as a local Theban deity of air and invisibility. When Theban princes expelled the Hyksos and founded the new kingdom, they elevated their patron god to national supremacy, merging him with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Thebes became the religious capital, and its priests became the arbiters of divine will. Victorious pharaohs showered the Karnak complex with loot from Nubia and the Levant. Tributes of gold, land, and slaves flowed into Amun's treasury. A single papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III records that the Amun temples owned over 420,000 head of cattle, 65 villages, 83 ships, and 81,000 workers. By 1150 BCE, the priesthood controlled nearly a third of Egypt's arable land and a comparable share of its labor force. This was not a church. It was a multinational corporation with a divine mandate, operating its own farms, workshops, mines, and trade fleets. It maintained private militias for protection. Its high priest was, in economic terms, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. This wealth bred corruption documented in the priest's own administrative papyri, which record embezzlement, bribery, and the systematic exploitation of temple laborers. The gap between the spiritual ideal and the grubby reality was a chasm, and it created a lethal problem for pharaohs. Their legitimacy stemmed from divine approval, mediated by these same priests. If the priests grew too powerful, they could veto royal authority by declaring the gods displeased. The relationship was a tense symbiosis. Direct confrontation was suicidal, as Akhenaten discovered when he tried to abolish the Amun cult entirely. His revolution collapsed, and the Amun priesthood returned stronger than ever. Pharaohs needed a new strategy. The title of God's wife of Amun existed earlier, often held by the queen or queen mother, linking the royal family directly to the god's cult. During the political fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period, the balance of power shifted. The Kushite pharaohs from Nubia reunified Egypt but faced a legitimacy problem. They needed the Amun priesthood's blessing. The priests demanded that henceforth the god's wife would be the pharaoh's unwed daughter, dedicated as a child, vowed to chastity, living permanently in Thebes under priestly supervision, and adopting her successor. It was hostage-taking, sanctified. The pharaoh surrendered a daughter permanently to priestly control. Ameniades I, daughter of Pharaoh Kashta, was the first Kushite princess to hold the role under these terms. Adoption created a chain of obligation running through the priesthood. Once adopted, the princess legally belonged to the temple's line of succession. Her vast estates were managed by, and ultimately for, the temple administration. Shepenwepet was a prime asset in this transaction. Her dedication was the price Asorkan III paid for Theban support. Back in the circular chamber, Shepenwepet's hands trembled as she undid the clasp of her golden collar. The priestesses helped, their fingers deft and impersonal. Each garment was removed, carefully folded, and placed in an alabaster chest. These were the trappings of Princess Shepenwepet. They represented the self scheduled for ritual death. Naked, she stepped into the basin. The liquid was shockingly cold, and then the natron bit. It was a chemical burn, she gasped. A priest began a low chant in Old Egyptian. Another approached with a razor of sharpened copper and shaved her head. Hair was identity. To lose it was to become anonymous. A permanently bald woman would be instantly recognizable anywhere in Egypt. Escape or disguise would be impossible. The natron solution was poured over her shaved scalp. The burn was excruciating. A rule had been drilled into her: no sound of distress. Any cry would signify unworthiness. It was the first test, to endure deliberate pain in perfect silence. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood and made no sound. When they lifted her from the basin, her skin was raw and burning. They dried her with rough linen and dressed her in a simple, sleeveless shift. They led her to an adjoining chamber. The central image was of Amun in his ithyphallic form. In this closed room, it felt like an instruction. The high priest Montumhat stepped forward. "You are no longer Shepenwepet, daughter of Asorkan. You are the god's wife." He gestured to a stone platform. "Lie down. The consecration must be completed." The euphemisms shed their veils. She looked at the door. The priestesses stood before it. She looked at the priests. In their painted faces, she saw not lust but bureaucratic focus. They were technicians performing a sacred procedure. The framework of belief paralyzed resistance. To fight was to defy the gods and doom the kingdom. Trembling, she lay down. What followed was a ritualized violation accompanied by chants and invocations, the language of spiritual union masking the act. It lasted for hours. She learned to dissociate, to watch from a numb distance. At dawn it ended. They washed her, anointed her, and dressed her in the full regalia of the god's wife. Cosmetics transformed the traumatized girl into an icon of authority. In 6 hours, she would stand before her father and the people and perform joy. Her new quarters were luxurious confinement. She had an entire wing of the temple, a staff, a treasury. Yet she was a prisoner. Every servant was a spy. Daily reports logged her speech, moods, requests, visitors, eating, prayers, and behavior. Attempts at forming bonds were punished. She was forbidden from leaving without escort. Family visits were staged and monitored. Hints of distress were reframed as humility. Contact with the outside world was strangled. Ritualized abuse functioned as control. Any perceived mistake in ritual duties triggered renewed consecration in the underground chambers. Resistance led to more sessions. Acceptance proved she could handle them. It was an inescapable loop. She administered vast estates, but priests controlled transactions. She had wealth on paper without agency. Years later, she was forced to witness and legitimize the initiation of her successor, Ameniades II, a child. By making the previous victim complicit, the system shattered solidarity and bound the women in shared guilt. A servant girl who overheard part of a session was forced to recant and flogged. The message spread: see nothing, say nothing. Montumhat made the threat explicit to Shepenwepet. If she spoke, her father's legitimacy would collapse. Her captivity became her father's ransom. She served for 42 years and died around age 56. Her funeral was magnificent. For centuries, that was the only story. Modern examination of her remains revealed healed fractures, degenerative joint disease, and chronic pelvic damage consistent with long-term physical abuse. The gold leaf hid the truth, but her bones testified. The system ended not through conscience but conquest. Persian rulers dismantled the priesthood's power. The last god's wife died without a successor. The system faded. The story reveals how advanced civilizations can engineer cruelty through theology, bureaucracy, economics, isolation, and the corruption of victims. Civilization did not prevent atrocity. It supplied the tools that made it sustainable and invisible.